On April 27, 1296, the Scottish army stood on a hillside near Dunbar Castle in southeastern Scotland. They watched the English army arrive. The Scots felt very safe because they were standing on high ground. There were about 10,000 Scottish soldiers. This group included almost all of Scotland's important leaders, like earls and knights. They had rebelled against England and replaced their king, John Balliol, with a group of nobles. They stayed on a slope called Spott Muir. This meant the English would have to run uphill to fight them. This should have made the Scots very hard to beat. Below them was the English army, led by John de Warenne. He had about 12,000 men. This included 3,000 soldiers on horses and many Welsh archers with longbows. The Scots thought the battle would be tough, but they believed they could win because they were at the top of the hill. Instead, they faced a total disaster that lasted only about 3 hours. In that short time, 10,000 Scottish soldiers were killed or captured. Scotland's entire group of leaders was captured. Suddenly, Scotland was no longer its own free country. King Edward I of England, who was called Longshanks, did in one afternoon what usually takes years. He completely took over Scotland. But this victory was so mean and brutal that it made the Scots want to fight back even harder. This led to famous heroes like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. On this day in 1296, England crushed Scotland so badly that it made the Scots fight back with more anger than ever before. To understand why this battle was such a mess, you have to know about the problems Scotland had before it. In the 1290s, Scotland didn't know who should be king. King Alexander III died in 1886, and his young heir died in 1990. Many people argued over who was the rightful king. The two main people were John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder. The Scottish nobles couldn't decide, so they made a big mistake. They asked King Edward I of England to choose for them. Edward was a very strong and smart leader. He had already taken over Wales and built giant stone castles there. He saw Scotland's problem as a chance to take control of them too. Edward said he would help only if the Scottish leaders promised that he was their boss. The desperate nobles said yes. Edward chose John Balliol to be king in 1292. But Balliol was a weak king. He did whatever Edward told him to do. For 4 years, Balliol ruled as Edward's puppet. But in 1295, the Scottish nobles got tired of being told what to do. They took away Balliol's power and picked 12 nobles to rule. They even made a deal with France to fight against England. This was a direct challenge to King Edward. Edward I responded quickly and with a lot of power. In March 1296, he put together the biggest army England had seen in a long time. He had about 25,000 to 30,000 men. He marched into Scotland with a plan to take over everything. His army went to Berwick upon Tweed, which was Scotland's richest town. What happened there was a terrible act meant to scare all of Scotland. Edward's soldiers attacked the town on March 30th. Edward ordered his men to kill everyone. History books say between 7,000 and 17,000 innocent people were killed over 3 days. Men, women, and children were all hurt. The streets were filled with blood. Even churches were not safe. Edward watched from his horse as his soldiers did this. The killing only stopped when Edward saw a woman being killed while she was giving birth. Berwick was a message: if you fight England, you will be destroyed. This scared many towns in Scotland, and they surrendered immediately. But the Scottish nobility, humiliated and enraged, gathered their forces and prepared to resist. The Scottish army met at Dunbar Castle in late April 1296. Dunbar was a strong fort on the coast. The Scottish force had 10,000 men, but this was not an army of regular soldiers. These were Scotland's best fighters, the earls and their knights. These were men who had fought in many wars. They were experienced warriors, wearing expensive armor and riding strong horses. They thought that because they were at the top of the hill, they would win. But they did not understand that Edward I had changed how war was fought. He used different types of soldiers: horses, foot soldiers and archers as a team. The Scots were about to learn this lesson in a very painful way. On April 27, 1296, the Earl of Surrey led the English army toward Dunbar. He was over 60 years old and very experienced. He was Edward's most trusted general. Surrey saw the Scots on the hill and knew attacking uphill was usually a bad idea. Cavalry charging uphill loses speed. Foot soldiers attacking uphill arrive tired. But Surrey had things the Scots didn't expect. His army included Welsh archers who could shoot uphill well. His cavalry was also better trained. Most importantly, Surrey saw that the Scots made a big mistake. They had a steep valley behind them, which meant they couldn't run away easily if the battle turned against them. Surrey decided to attack anyway. He sent his Welsh archers to the front. He ordered them to shoot at the Scots to make them angry so they would leave their spot and attack. The battle began with Welsh archers shooting many arrows at the Scots on the hill. The Scots had some archers, but they were not as good as the Welsh ones. As arrows hit them, the Scottish leaders had to choose. They could stay and be shot at, or they could run down the hill and fight. The Scottish nobles were too confident. They made the fatal decision to charge. Thousands of Scottish knights on horses began riding down the slope toward the English lines. This was exactly what Surrey wanted. A charge downhill gains speed, but is hard to control. When it hits the enemy, the attackers are often messy and unorganized. The Scottish cavalry hit the English lines hard. For a brief moment, it looked like the Scots might win. But Surrey had kept his heavy cavalry in reserve. Now he ordered them to attack. 3,000 fresh English knights on powerful horses smashed into the messy Scottish line. This collision was a disaster for the Scots. English knights in full armor crashed into the Scottish horsemen who were already disorganized. The Scottish line buckled and then broke. What happened next was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Scottish cavalry ran away, fleeing back up the hill toward their own foot soldiers, with English knights chasing them. The Scottish foot soldiers saw their knights running, and they panicked too, but running away was almost impossible. The Scots had put themselves in a spot with the Spott Muir ravine behind them. This was a steep stream that could not be crossed quickly. The retreating Scots became trapped between the English knights and the stream. English knights rode through the crowd, cutting down men from behind. Soldiers who reached the water tried to cross, but fell in and drowned because their armor was too heavy. Others were stepped on by their own friends. The English knights showed no mercy. They chased individual Scottish soldiers for miles across the countryside and killed them. The battlefield and the area around it became a killing field. Bodies covered the slopes of the hill and filled the stream. The number of Scottish losses at Dunbar was catastrophic. English stories say 10,000 Scots were killed, but that is likely too high. Modern historians think between 3,000 and 7,000 were killed. Another 3,000 to 5,000 were captured. This meant the Scottish army was destroyed. But the real disaster was who was captured. Scotland's entire military leadership was taken prisoner. The Earls of Atholl, Ross, and Menteith were caught. Over 100 Scottish knights were taken. These were the men who ran the country. Their capture meant Scotland had no one left to lead a fight. The English did not treat them as honorable prisoners. Edward I ordered them locked up in England in bad conditions. Some were kept in chains in dungeons. Others were marched through the streets to be embarrassed. Some were eventually killed for treason. This was not a fair war. This was taking over a country through fear and shame. The captured nobles were basically slaves. Their land was taken, and their families lost everything. Scotland's leaders were destroyed in one afternoon. English losses were very minimal, maybe only 100 to 200 men. The battle was so one-sided that it was more of a massacre than a fight. The Earl of Surrey told Edward I that it was a complete victory. Edward was very happy. He had reached his goal of destroying Scottish resistance much faster than he thought. Over the next few weeks, Edward's army marched through Scotland. Town after town opened its gates without fighting. Castles gave up. By July 1296,
Edward had marched to the far north and declared Scotland was conquered. He took the crown away from John Ballio and put him in prison. Edward took the Stone of Scone, the ancient stone used for crowning Scottish kings, to London as a trophy. It stayed there for 700 years. He said Scotland was now ruled directly by English officials. Scotland, as its own kingdom, was gone. All of this happened because of the huge defeat at Dunbar. But Edward's victory also created his future failure. The mean things done at Berwick and the shame at Dunbar made the Scots want revenge. The regular people, who didn't get to make the decisions about war, had watched their leaders give up. They saw English soldiers take over their country and demand money. This made the common people want to fight back. Within a year of Dunbar, William Wallace, a man who was not a high noble, started a war against the English. Wallace's fight would lead